very vast kingdom when you think sort of that Egypt area all the way across to India. So it was a big kingdom. And then we have met Mordecai, who is a central character in the story. He is Jewish. He's from the line of King Saul. And there are suggestions he is going to succeed where Saul and his descendants failed. Then we have Esther, who is also Jewish and was effectively adopted by Mordecai. She has now become queen. And King Xerxes doesn't actually know of her Jewish ancestry because Mordecai told her to keep that quiet so that she could become queen. And in the third installment, just last week, we met a man called Haman, who was an Agagite, the descendant of, that's good boo there, he was a descendant of King Agag, who was the cause of King Saul, who was previously king of Israel. He was the cause of King Saul to be rejected by God, and so his relationship to King Agag is quite significant in terms of the story saying this is the baddie who Mordecai needs to overcome effectively. And now Mordecai, in the last chapter 3, refused to bow down before Haman, a bit like, if you know the story of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who got thrown into the fiery furnace for refusing to bow in the book of Daniel. And we see here, just like them, that Mordecai was being faithful to his God and refusing to bow down before others. And this act, it angered Haman, who discovered that he was a Jew. And so through his evil scheme, he got an order to destroy all the Jews across the whole of this vast kingdom, all 127 provinces. So it was a big, big decree. And it is here, with this decree going out to all the provinces, where we enter our chapter today. And we find out today how Mordecai and Esther are going to respond to this impending atrocity coming their way. And we also see in this chapter, we begin to see how God might be quietly working behind the scenes when it seems like he has abandoned his people once and for all, where it seems like there is no hope, where grief overwhelms his people. We're going to see where God is in this moment behind the scenes. But you have to be paying attention in the chapter to spot it. And I think that's maybe a good lesson for us today. Like so often, we need to actually pay attention to spot where God is at work through the sort of troubles of life that comes our way. And so we'll explore a bit of that today. But where we start with today, we start with Mordecai and how he expresses great grief at this news. He tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. We were also told that in the small cities across all the provinces that the reaction was similar. There was great wailing and bitter grief across all these places. And sackcloth and ashes were a common expression of mourning and grief in those days. I guess in some ways it might be similar to how we might wear black attire for a funeral, or traditionally a widow might wear a black veil. It's a similar concept they would put on the sackcloth and ashes. It was a visible expression of an inward state. And we are told that Mordecai, in this state, went to the king's gate, which is where we quite often find Mordecai. It is where he has already discovered in chapter 2 the plot to kill King Xerxes, and managed to save the day and earn favour with the king. It would have been a place where he knew he could get the attention of others, and in particular get the attention of Esther, who it seems did not know about this plot of Haman. But we learn that she was greatly distressed because of Mordecai, who was her adoptive father, that he was showing these signs of great and deep grief. She was concerned. And so because of this concern, because of finding out of Mordecai's grief, it begins a dialogue in our chapter between Mordecai and Esther about this order, this instruction to destroy the Jews. And Mordecai, he instructs Esther to go and speak to the king, to beg for mercy and to plead for her people. This was a chance, an opportunity to maybe save the people and overturn this decree. And we naturally at this moment, I think, would expect the next response in the story to be Esther going and doing just this task. But we are actually told that Esther, in her view, is unable to go to the king because the rule states that if she is not summoned by the king, and it has been a while since she has been summoned, then she would most likely be sentenced to death for doing so. And so it's a very serious moment, and maybe in that moment, oh no, well, what can we do now? If Esther's the only hope, what can we do now? Maybe she thought that her position was comfortable and safe, and so didn't want to rock the boat, which maybe would explain Mordecai's upcoming response, which we hear just after this. But maybe it was simply that the rules didn't let her speak to the king, and so she felt that her hands were tied. Maybe it was a mixture of both going on in that moment. And often in these scenarios, bringing it to ourselves today, we can often feel maybe a bit like Esther, either not wanting to rock the boat to risk losing our comforts and our positions. Though I'd say for Esther it clearly goes beyond this to some extent, as it was literally a matter of life and death for her. Whereas for our comforts today, we often don't have quite such a risk. It may be just a bit of reputation or maybe a bit of influence that we lose. But we maybe do feel that in moments where we think our comforts overwhelm us, and so we don't want to respond. Or maybe we can feel that our hands are tied. And because our hands are tied, we don't actually look for a solution. We don't look for an alternative option. And things just carry on. We just decide to turn a blind eye to it and just let the events unfold. We can often be like that. Be like Esther. But actually, Esther's response in our story, it leads to a stark warning from Mordecai. But also, it's not just a stark warning. I actually think these words of Mordecai, they show a man who has faith in God's deliverance, a man who trusts God's promise, even in the midst of such a dark time. He warns her. He warns her not to think that being silent would spare her or her father's family. This great travesty would come against her too. And he spells out this reality of the situation to her. But he also tells her that actually, yes, this travesty will come to you too, but if you stay silent, well, deliverance will come from somewhere else. But that will be too late for her, because God will raise someone from somewhere else. But she will be caught up in all of this, possibly because of her closeness to the king. In an uprising, the royal court around her would maybe turn against her and against Mordecai, against her family, knowing that, finding out that she is of a Jewish descendancy and the Jewish people coming against her, they will come and fight. You've got to understand this is sort of like a war zone scene that's going on in this moment. But we're not given the details. But either way, we find out that silence will have no benefit for Esther. But reflecting on these words from Mordecai, he actually believes a deliverer would rise up from somewhere. That is quite significant. He trusts that God has not abandoned his people. He trusts that God is not going to forget his promises to the people of God. He's promised to always be with them, that there will always be this remnant. He's promised to save them. So with this command to destroy all the Jewish people, he's aware of God's promises and he trusts that God will come and save the day. And I think given the circumstances and the dire outlook where there is no hope, it is a remarkable faith that Mordecai shows in this moment. How many of us in our darkest moments lose sight of God's faithfulness, lose sight of our trust in God's promises, lose sight that we have a loving and gracious God. And yet, here was Mordecai, trusting that God will raise up a deliverer, trusting that there is hope in God. It doesn't mention God in the passage, but I'd say it's pretty clear that he is in mind in this moment. And then following this warning comes what is probably the most famous line of the book of Esther. And it's also a real clue that maybe God is at work in all that is going on here with Mordecai and Esther, and all that we have already heard so far, and all that is going to come ahead. And Mordecai says, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Those words, "for such a time as this," is such a well-known phrase. And we should maybe be picking up here that this story about Esther becoming queen was God putting her in place for such a time where things couldn't get any worse for the Jewish people. It's remarkable when we reflect back on the events of our lives, especially those really low moments that we have, that pain, searing pain we can sometimes feel for all sorts of reasons. How often it is in those moments that we can recognize the people and the things that is put in place by God and keep us going. When we reflect back as people of God, we begin to see his faithfulness to his children. We begin to see where he's been at work in those moments we don't necessarily see it. We maybe won't see it for years to come. But as we reflect back on those pains that we feel, that actually I can see God has put us in this place, put certain people around us for such a time as this, because it's there where we suddenly see things come into place in the midst of what is great chaos in life. And it is true here in our story, back to Mordecai, as Mordecai delivers his message to Esther, and it is also true for us today. It is always true that it is not always the obvious people or things either. We sometimes expect all these things to be obvious, but they are not. In this story, we have a descendant of Saul who was rejected by God, who is the ancestor of Shimei, who went against King David, the good king of Israel, who had a heart after God's heart, which makes him a very unlikely candidate to be a hero in this story, because people remember his ancestry and think, oh, and here we go again. But here is Mordecai actually doing the opposite to his ancestors. He is an unlikely hero who God is clearly going to use for his people. And we also have Esther, who is an orphan, which also makes her an unlikely hero in the context of the times. She would have been someone who they would have viewed as someone maybe a bit destitute, someone without limited hope, limited prospects because of her life circumstances. And yet, God has raised her up from orphan to queen, to be able to step in the place and help to save God's people. It's a remarkable story. And here we are with this announcement for such a time as this. It's a clue for us as to where this is going. God has set up some favourable circumstances. And we know as the story goes on through Esther that these circumstances, that God through them is going to overcome evil and deliver his people. Not through their own strength, not through their own merit, but through two unlikely candidates. And it's from here we get Esther's second response. She is going to do it at last. She responds, she is going to seek to speak to the king. But first she tells Mordecai to gather all the Jews in the city together to fast for her. And she will do the same with her attendants. Knowing the gravity of the situation, we get an act of faith from Esther here too. They were going to fast for 3 days. And now one way that the book of Esther has historically been interpreted is allegorically, which means that is different parts will have a different specific spiritual meaning, that they point towards something greater than what we maybe just see on paper. And that doesn't say that this isn't historically true, say it's allegorical, it is historically true, but actually history points to something even greater. It's an echo of a greater truth, and so many stories throughout the history of the world point to a greater truth. And some have interpreted this, and I think this is actually really quite a remarkable observation if it's true, that this fast of Esther, this 3-day fast, it points to the death of Jesus Christ. And part of this is because the assumption is that this fast took place on what is the 14th to the 16th of the month of Nisan. And that's partly determined because on the 13th, we're already told that the 13th of Nisan is when the letters were sent out to the provinces to declare the destruction of the Jews. And being in the city of Susa, where this claim letter went out, it would have been there immediately. So they would have been the first to find out. And the next day does make sense. And now, why am I rittering on about these dates? I'm expecting you all to be jumping up knowing this. Oh, I'm joking. I had to read about this as well to make sure it was correct. But it's important because guess what day Jesus died on? It is understood that Jesus died on the 14th of the month of Nisan, the day that this fast started, and the resurrection was on the 16th of Nisan, the day the fast ended. And we learn in our story, following on from this chapter, that Esther rose from her fasting and went to intercede before the king to bring about the deliverance of her people on the third day of the fast, on the 16th of Nisan. And so some of these allegorical interpretations, they say, well, actually, this fast, this sort of time of grieving, points to the death of Jesus. This instruction of Esther is an echo of a greater truth. It is effectively a prophetic word pointing to that Jesus is going to die 14th of Nisan. And it also points to the resurrection, the deliverance of the people, the speaking to the interceding to the king is on the 16th. The rising up of Jesus is when the deliverance of the people of God occurs as well. But the day that Esther rises is the day that Jesus rises and saves his people. So there's this allegorical picture. And it's worth noting that these sorts of interpretations, they are quite heavily debated. But considering the nature of Esther, having the hidden God who is at work in the background of the story, and there are other things I'm not going to go through this now, but other things in the book of Esther where people have pointed out that God can be seen with some of the wordplay that happens in the background in the initial Hebrew language. That's another point. But yeah, Esther, we're saying God is hidden in the background. So it would seem really quite fitting that there are these subtleties which have been woven into the story, woven into the text, that they are a part of it, which point to a greater story, point to God, point to God's plans and how he's going to work in the world. And we know that Jesus himself says that the scriptures, that they speak of him. And so it should be no surprise that maybe in this story, which may seem quite an awful story in many ways, that actually there is an element of Jesus too, of this story speaking of Jesus Christ. Because he's already told us that the scriptures do. And so I think it's a wonderful and remarkable observation in this passage, which maybe can help us understand Esther pointing towards our Lord Jesus Christ. And finally, Esther closes with this bold line. She says, "If I perish, I perish." She acknowledges the task before her, and she willingly sacrifices herself for the chance of saving her people. It is a moment of great courage, and it shows her faithfulness to her adopted father and also to her people, that she was willing to go and die for them for the chance of their deliverance. And again, you can potentially see this as something that echoes this greater truth about Jesus Christ, the one who was willing to sacrifice himself for his people. It is in fact a great act of love from Esther. As Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And that is what Esther is about to go and do, or she was willing to do. We know in the story that she doesn't end up dying, but she was willing to do that for her people. In Mordecai and Esther, we are starting to see a glimpse of Jesus Christ. Christ is the one who succeeds where Adam, who caused the fall, caused sin to enter the world, disobeyed God's commands. Christ is the one who succeeds where Adam failed. And we see in this story already that Mordecai is the one succeeding where Saul failed. There's a bit of an echo of that story happening there. We also have Esther, one who is described as beautiful. And it's a word, the opposite is described of Jesus in the book of Isaiah in the prophecy, but it is also a word which is often ascribed to Christ. Not in terms of his physical beauty, but we use it to describe his righteousness and his glory. We use the term like Christ's beauty, and God himself is described as one who is beautiful as well. And so it's maybe a picture of one that pointing again towards Christ, this attribute, this description of God, this description of Christ that we have. But also we see that she shows great courage, as does Christ, as is seen in his prayer in Gethsemane when he is in that battle of he knows he's going to die on the cross, and he asks the Lord, ask God, can you take this cup from me? But if it's your will, then so be it, effectively. But we see that great courage of Christ in that moment, and we're seeing that here in Esther. If I perish, I will perish. It's a very similar concept. And she also shows great love by being willing to lay down her life, as does Jesus. We're beginning to see how Esther and Mordecai are these echoes of Jesus Christ and point us towards him. It's a wonderful thing that happens so often in the Old Testament, where the characters of the stories are somehow people who point us to truths about Jesus Christ and about God himself. And we see it here. As ever, those who are pictures of Christ in the Old Testament, they are not perfect. In fact, many of the pictures of Christ, the people who are used for that, they are very flawed people. But that's because they are not Jesus Christ himself and are just simply pointing towards him. And so we see Esther and Mordecai are not perfect too. But in this chapter, we begin to see how God might be at work behind the scenes in this story. For what purpose he may have placed Esther as king. We see the faith of Mordecai, the courage and love of Esther, and we get a glimpse of Jesus Christ himself. As we continue to go in our worship today, as we go about our day, let us be reflecting on this story. Let us begin to be courageous in the Lord, trusting in his promises. And if we find ourselves in times of struggle today, if we find ourselves in a time where God feels absent, where we have no answers to what is going on around us, where there's pain and grief in our hearts, let us remember God. And let us find him at work in the background, knowing that he is for us, knowing that he is faithful to his promises, that he is working all things together for the good of those who love God. That is a promise of the Bible, knowing that God loves us and nothing can separate us from his love. We have a God who cares for us. And even if he feels absent in your life today, know and be assured that God is at work. It may be in the background. You may not see it today, but in the years to come, you will see it, because you have a caring and loving God. So put your trust in him, because he is a good God and he promises to work for your good through Jesus Christ. Amen.